And we're joined now by Professor Dewald Van Niekerk. He is head of the African Center for Disaster Studies at the University of Northwest. Professor, thank you very much for your time. Yours is to study disasters. South Africa experiencing, or should I say, be specific. I need to be specific in this instance. Sorry there, I've been talking for quite some time. I'm getting tongue-tied. So let's focus the attention on KZN. We saw these floods in 2019, but the scale is nothing compared to what we are seeing in 2022. Is this something that should have been or could have been anticipated?
Good morning. Yes, I certainly think so. If you look at the history of natural hazards within KZN, and especially the past 10 years, it is something that we certainly are aware of. It's not the first time that we are experiencing loss in terms of flood. And there's certainly certain questions that must be asked of our provincial and our local government in terms of what has happened with the disaster preparedness planning in this case.
All right, so something needs to be asked of the state of planning of the provincial authorities. And so what is your assessment? Were there any plans in place, or is this really something that is a complete surprise in terms of the scale at which these floods hit KZN?
No, I certainly think the scale is a massive surprise. We haven't seen this in the past known history of South Africa. So yes, it is definitely a surprise. The questions needs to be asked about the disaster risk planning and the disaster preparedness planning, whether that was in place and whether these structures are adequate. Our research over the past 20 years in this area shows that since the promulgation of the Disaster Management Act in 2002, there hasn't been a lot of movement in many municipalities. We've seen some movement in the metro municipalities that have set up their disaster management structures, etc. But it is not functioning the way it should be. There is understaffed structures that we sit with. The disaster management centers are placed according to my assessment in the wrong format of government. They are placed in the wrong place in government. This hinders their ability to make certain decisions and to hold other sectors accountable for disaster risk management. What we must understand is that it is not only the disaster management center that's responsible. This comes down straight on the laps of our politicians. A lot of the decision making and poor development that has been taking place are to blame for the situation we find ourselves in. So on the one hand, it would be absolutely wrong to call this a natural disaster. This is an absolute man-made disaster, human-made disaster. And people need to be held accountable. We need to look at the systematic, wide problem that we sit with and ask why do we find ourselves in this situation that we are in now.
Professor, you touch on a very good point there. In fact, you are about to get a lot of politicians hot under the collar because what they will certainly say, and I have no doubt in my mind they will say this, is that this is a natural disaster. You are calling it a man-made disaster. Explain your characterization of it in this fashion, that it is a man-made disaster in part.
Well, a disaster, the definition of a disaster is an event that exceeds our ability to cope with it using our own resources. A disaster can only happen if there's an impact on humans and the systems on which we depend. Now, what we sit with now is that people are looking at this event and are crying natural disaster, therefore taking the responsibility totally away from them, taking accountability away, and that is totally wrong. If we assess the situation and ask why do we see the damage that is now being done, I think it's quite clear that this is a case of poor urban planning. It is a case of allowing people to settle in marginalized areas. It's a case of unemployment, of poverty, of poor and failed development. That is why we sit with the situation we are in now. If we could supply people with decent, risk-averse houses, we wouldn't have this situation. If we could address informal settlements in these low-lying areas, if we could have addressed the removal of topsoil and vegetation that we see in certain areas, the settling of people in slopes. These are all things that's within the power of human beings to address. Yet we are not doing this.
Professor, you know, what you are raising right now, you're triggering a number of issues in my head, and one particular incident that's similar because people died there as well, but of course not to the scale we are seeing in KZN. Not so long ago, there were floods in Umdantsane, that's in the Eastern Cape, and people had built on floodplains. Guess what the provincial government said there? That we had been trying to get the people to move from this area for some time. People don't listen to us. This is what politicians are saying. People don't listen to us, so what are we to do? Is that a defense from people who are authorized with actually forcefully removing people for their own safety?
Well, there's two sides to that coin. On the one hand, yes, people do settle in unsafe environments. We need to be asking the question, why? Mostly it is because it's quite convenient for people to settle there. They settle close to resources. This could be, in most cases, people settling close to a water source. They might be settling close to urban and peri-urban areas, which allows them access to employment and transportation, etc. There's many reasons for it. On the other hand, people knowingly settle in unsafe conditions, hoping that they would be removed and given better housing, etc. So yes, this happens as well. So I'm not blind to the fact that people can definitely play the system in that way. But in most instances, and this has been shown worldwide, people living in poverty and people that has got no other option than to urbanize settle in these marginalized areas. These are the only areas that's most of the time available, because people with education, with money, will not settle there. If there's proper enforcement of bylaws and planning, then the municipalities won't allow people to settle in these areas. But sometimes it also happens that this becomes a political ball, where certain councillors would allow people to settle in the area knowing that it is at risk, but just to score some political points. Now, I'm not trying to put the blame, all of this, on the shoulders of politicians. But certainly these are questions that we need to be asking and trying to figure out, why is the system so broken that we now sit with these massive losses because of one natural hazard that has come along. And believe me, it won't be the last time that we're going to have this conversation.
Professor, perhaps it leads me to one simple question. Do we have adequate disaster management in South Africa, disaster management systems in South Africa, or is that a bit of a stretch if you are talking in the fashion that you are talking, that it's a complete failure to plan?
It'll be unfair to say we don't have any systems in place. I think the problem that we sit with is largely linked to different provinces and linked to different municipalities. There's some provinces that have brilliant systems in place, and you can see that also in the way that they are managing their risk. And in some areas, there's not a lot in place, and there's not budget given to the disaster management centers to do what they have to do. There's also a lack of skills or a lack of enough staff to be doing what they have to do. I bet you if we now look at the KZN Disaster Management Center, you would find probably less than 20 very knowledgeable people working there. So of a province of this nature, you can't expect 20 people to be able to do this work. And if we downscale that into local government, you will even find less people doing this job. So there's definitely a lack of support for the disaster management structures. And as I mentioned previously, the other problem is that these disaster management structures aren't situated in an area or in an office of authority. Therefore, why would housing, why would local economic development, why would transportation listen to a person that is called the head of the disaster management center, yet they are buried somewhere below the fire chief or some other area in Kokta? You see, it's a system problem that needs to be addressed. And with the COVID-19 pandemic, this is something that our research has shown, and it's the report that has gone to government has shown this as well, that the placement of the disaster management centers from a national to a local level needs to be addressed. And they need to be given a mandate, a budget, and authority to act. Otherwise, we can't ask the disaster management centers every time, what is going on? You are not doing your job, yet we don't support them to do their job. And that is a key component, I think, in government that urgently must be addressed.
Professor Van Niekerk, final question to you, and briefly, if you can. The President, I think it was about a week ago, if not two, he appeared at the Human Rights Commission, and part of the wording he used, which he said he struggled with sometimes, is that South Africa is referred as a middle-income country. In terms of our early warning systems, how do we compare to other middle-income countries?
Well, very interesting question. We've actually just completed research in this area, looking at what is functioning within 5 SADC member states, which one was South Africa. And I must say, in terms of our meteorological agencies, in terms of the South African Weather Service, a lot of the other countries in the SADC region are quite dependent on our systems and the data which we supply. From a hydrometeorological perspective, I think we do have some very good early warning systems and infrastructure in place in order to give these warnings. The problem is that the communication side of that is a bit lacking. In other words, if there's a warning that is issued, if we say this is a warning 8 or a 9 or a code red or orange or whatever the system allows for, there's a lack of interpretation by those that's going to be affected by it, and there's a lack of action because that whole system is not totally implemented. So if we have to compare South Africa to other middle-income countries, in terms of meteorology, I think we are up there with the best. But when it comes to enhancing local early warning systems, community-based early warning systems, and inculcating or also using indigenous knowledge systems for early warning, this is where there's a total lack at local level, and this is where it is most needed. Right. And, one must not think that an early warning system is this NASA center of computers. It could be something very simple as a pole next to a river with markings on it. And these are the type of things that we must pay attention to up to community level.